Slaves throughout history were frequently subjected to the inhumane practice of forced procreation, in which their reproductive capacities were used for the economic gain of their owners. Want to know how slaves were forced to procreate? Stay tuned. This practice occurred frequently in the context of forced procreation. Slaves were not only deprived of their fundamental human rights, but also treated as commodities. In addition, they were forced to procreate in order to increase their owner's workforce and provide a steady supply of labor. This dehumanizing method entailed the systematic pairing of persons without consideration to their emotional relationships or personal decisions, based on the perceived physical traits or skills the individuals possessed. The owners of slaves had influence over all aspects of their lives, including the personal interactions their slaves had with one another. Slaves were occasionally coerced or manipulated by their masters into developing connections with particular persons, so that the masters might produce offspring with the characteristics they desired. The tragic truth is that these coerced marriages destroyed families and eliminated any notion of agency or autonomy. This is a fact that breaks our hearts. The children who were born of these forced couplings were frequently doomed to lives of extreme deprivation and were trapped in a cycle of hereditary servitude. The inhumanity of slavery is painfully brought to mind by the practice of forced procreation, which serves as a stark reminder of how economic interests were prioritized over the fundamental rights and dignity of humans. This practice dates back to the time of slavery. How did the dark apparatus of slavery control people's most private moments? How did slave owners coerce women into having children against their will? Explore the unspoken past of forced reproduction, a time when power, brutality, and humanity converged in unimaginable ways. An important historical turning point, the 19th century abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, also allowed for the growth of troubling practices like slave breeding and sex farms. Slaveholders attempted to safeguard their financial interests after the abolition of the trade by subjecting enslaved people to forced procreation and sexual exploitation. These heinous customs furthered the dehumanization of African Americans by exploiting their bodies for financial gain. Slave breeders and sex farms are a sobering reminder of the extremes to which some people would go in order to keep control over and make money off of the lives of those they formerly traded as commodities. When the transatlantic slave trade was limited, slave owners in the American South resorted to a worrying practice, raising captives like animals. Due to restrictions on bringing in fresh captives from Africa, some slave owners began treating their slaves like commodities, deliberately mating those with desirable features in order to enlarge their workforce. Slavery was inhumane because it deprived slaves of their freedom and dignity while treating them as a commodity. The inhumanity of treating people as commodities is a chilling reminder of what may happen when power is uncontrolled and prejudice is institutionalized. Slave breeding farms were depressing places in the American South where people were bred for sale. There were as many as 70 of these farms at their peak, all reaping the benefits of forced human reproduction. Members of families were separated, and individuals suffered unspeakable atrocities. Slavery on these farms was emblematic of how people were dehumanized for financial gain. Discussions regarding racism, inequality, and the lingering consequences of systemic oppression are still influenced by the legacy of misery and injustice from this terrible period in history. The brutal realities of human bondage were exploited by wealthy plantation owners who saw slave reproduction as a lucrative endeavor. This revolting custom entailed treating slaves as property and coercing them into reproducing for the sake of profit. The owner's goal was to maximize their workforce efficiency and cut costs by deliberately pairing people with complementary skills. This exploitative method demonstrated the depths to which avarice and dehumanization may reach because it dehumanized both the enslaved people and their descendants. Understanding the terrible extent to which commercial interests were favored over basic human dignity requires acknowledging this tragic chapter in history. Women under slavery were subjected to inhumane treatment and reduced to little more than reproductive machines by a patriarchal society. Masters mercilessly used their animals' physical characteristics, health, and intelligence to breed children with desirable qualities. This inhumane treatment furthered the institution of slavery and demonstrated how little value was placed on the freedom and worth of the people involved. It is imperative that we confront historical injustices and fight towards a more equitable future, because the lasting impact of this cruelty is a vivid reminder of the systematic oppression and intersectional exploitation that occurred during that dark age. Female slaves endured physical labor and degrading sexual assault from masters and overseers. This horrific abuse often led to forced pregnancies, continuing subjugation. These women were abused and denied body autonomy. Understanding systematic injustice and the resilience of victims requires acknowledging this tragic past. It reminds us of the essential need to fight all types of exploitation and oppression that degrades human life. Children of sex farms were deprived of their humanity and subjected to unimaginable agony when they were taken from their parents against their will. The legacy of these splits is a terrifying reminder of the dehumanization that was done on the most defenseless among us. Thanks for watching. For more, kindly subscribe to our channel.